So for those of you who've watched a few of my videos in the past, you'll know that I've had the Motorola G30 for a few months now, done a couple of videos on it, testing out the camera and the battery and everything like that. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to compare the Motorola G30 to its sibling, the G10. Now the G10 comes in at a little bit cheaper than the G30, and it does sacrifice a few specs against the G30. So I'm just going to compare the two, and if you're looking for a budget phone, whether these two are on your radar or not, hopefully it will give you a bit of info and help you in your quest of finding a new phone. So upon looking at the Motorola G30 and the G10 from the front, you'll be pretty hard pressed to know the difference. They both have a 6.5 inch HD display with a 720p resolution, pretty thick bezel on the bottom, and then a dewdrop notch at the top which houses a 13 megapixel f2.2 lens on the G30 and an 8 megapixel f2.2 selfie camera on the G10. So a high resolution selfie camera for the G30. It also has a slightly larger 1/3.1 inch sensor over the 1/4.0 inch sensor on the G10. So as well as the higher resolution, you're also getting a larger and better quality sensor, which should theoretically bring in more light and therefore better quality selfie photos. I haven't noticed a huge difference in the two. They're both pretty good, so there's not really much to complain about there. The other main difference is the G30 has a 90 Hz refresh rate, whereas on the G10 you're stuck with just a standard 60 Hz. But other than that, they're both the same. They've both got decent brightness, good colour. I do put the colour saturation to saturated on a lot of the phones that I use just because I like the nice bright colours on the display. But obviously you can choose that to whatever you want. And both screens have the adaptive brightness feature, which you will find on a lot of other budget phones. This isn't obviously unique to these two, but that just adjusts the brightness to whatever surroundings you're in. So if you're outside, it will crank the brightness right up to the top. And then obviously if you're sat at home in the dark or whatever, it will crank it down a little bit. So that's a nice feature to have even at this price point. Okay, so before I start this next little bit, I just want to say that I've had some nice shiny new lights turn up, which will hopefully make your viewing experience a little bit better than what it has been once I tinker around with the brightness for shadows and all that sort of stuff. But to be honest, it's got to be better than what it was before. But if we go on to the build on the back of the G30 and the G10, unsurprisingly, they're both made of plastic. But on the G30, you get a smooth matte finish. But on the G10, again, you get a matte finish, but this time you have like a ripple effect, which does make the phone a little bit easier to handle without a case. But of course, in true Motorola fashion, you do get a clear case bundled in the box so you can protect the phones from the get-go. Unfortunately, again, in true Motorola fashion, you don't get any kind of screen protection pre-applied on the phones. So that is something that you will have to fork out for extra. And buttons and ports, they're both very, very similar. On the left-hand side, you get your SIM tray, which obviously houses your SIM card and you can use a micro SD card. On the right, you get your textured power button, volume rocker, and your dedicated Google Assistant button. On the bottom, you get a microphone, USB-C charging port, and speaker grill. And then up top, you get a 3.5mm headphone jack. And this is where there is a slight difference. On the G30 you get an extra microphone, but on the G10 you don't. In terms of the batteries on both of these phones, you get a 5000 milliamp battery in both, which does provide you with easily a day's battery life, sometimes two if you're a light user. The G30 supports 15 watt fast charging, whereas the G10 is unfortunately stuck at just 10 watts. So you are going to be looking at a couple of hours at least to charge your G10 to full. And if we quickly talk performance on both of these phones, on the G10 you have a Snapdragon 460 processor, which is a very budget processor to put in smartphones these days. It's good for everyday use, scrolling through the internet, doing a bit of social media, obviously doing a bit of photography and some very light gaming. But if you're a heavy gamer, this definitely isn't going to be the phone for you. The G30 is upgraded to a Snapdragon 662 processor. This is still a budget processor, but it is considerably more powerful than the 460 and the G10. If you're someone that does a pretty good amount of gaming, this is definitely going to be the phone for you. So for me, I found that everyday use on the G30 is considerably better because of that 90 Hz display, the better processor than what it is on the G10. Now lastly, if we talk about the camera setups on both the G30 and the G10. So on the G10 you get a 48 megapixel main camera which pixel bins down to 12 megapixels, but this is upgraded to a 64 megapixel main sensor on the G30, which again pixel bins down to 16 megapixel images. This will allow you to obviously get brighter photos in low light, but at a slightly lower resolution. Both main cameras have an f1.7 aperture, so they're nice and wide, so they should provide plenty of light into your images. Both phones are backed up by an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera with an f2.2 aperture, and of course with every other phone with ultra-wides, especially at this price point, these are going to be much less quality than the main sensor, but they do add a good amount of flexibility to these cameras. And then lastly, you get a 2 megapixel macro and depth cameras on both phones. These are both f2.4. The depth sensors I generally don't have much of an issue with, as these do help in your portrait shots, blurring out the background. But these 2 megapixel macro cameras that they put on smartphones, I really don't like. Even if they upgraded it to a 5 megapixel, I would be slightly happier, but these 2 megapixel images are just terrible quality, and it's just really if you're just messing around taking a few close-ups. But other than that, the main cameras on both of these phones produce nice photos with good detail and good colour, and the ultra-wides, like I said, as to be expected, these aren't as good a quality, but there isn't a huge amount of colour shift between the main and the ultra-wide cameras that I have found on other phones that I reviewed in the past. Video on both of these phones tops out at 1080p at either 30 or 60 frames per second. And then just quickly going back to the selfie camera, you can shoot 1080p video on that, but you are restricted to just 30 frames per second on that camera. So that rounds up my comparison between the Motorola G10 and the Motorola G30. Both of these phones offer some pretty good specs at a pretty low asking price. At the moment, the G10 from Argos in the UK is around 120 quid. So for that price, you're doing pretty well. The G30, however, if you look on Amazon right now, you can get it for 140, which at that price is a steal. Would I like to have seen 1080p screens on these phones? Absolutely. But Motorola are pretty well known for bringing 720p panels to their budget smartphones, so it's not really something that I'm going to complain about too much. But let me know in the comments what you think. Do you have either of these phones? Do you have another Motorola phone? And don't forget to check out my coverage on other Motorola smartphones. I've got the G8 Power, the G9 Plus, and also the G9 Play. So don't forget to check those out on my channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ding the notification bell so you're notified when I make a new video. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.